Before I introduce our moderator for today's event, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley program. The Buckley program is dedicated to the promotion of intellectual diversity on Yale's campus. We achieve this goal in a number of ways, including our speaker events, firing line debates like this one, internships for undergraduates, and various other activities. If you're interested in learning more about the Buckley program, please visit our website, buckleyprogram.com. So now to introduce our moderator. Dr. Costas Meghir is the Douglas A. Warner III Professor of Economics at Yale. He is an International Research Associate at the IFS in London, as well as a JPAL affiliate. He is Fellow of the Econometric Society, Fellow of the British Academy, and Fellow of the Society for Labor Economics. He has been co-editor of Econometrica and joint managing editor of the Economic Journal. He has published in leading journals, including Econometrica, the American Economic Review, the Review of Economic Studies, and the Journal of Political Economy. His research spans a broad set of fields, including on household behavior, the impact of welfare benefits on labor supply and risk protection, on measuring risk faced by households and assessing its impact, on wage formation in frictional labor markets, and on human capital formation. He has recently been working on policies fostering early childhood development among the poor. He received his PhD from Manchester University, and he teaches labor economics and econometrics to undergraduates and graduate students here at Yale. So at the end, we'll have time for questions, so please raise your hand and we'll pass you a mic. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Costas Meghir.
Thanks very much. Well, it's great to be here. It's an important and exciting topic. Both the general idea of expressing diverse views in this time when sometimes screaming sounds more than is heard more than a rational debate. It's great to have the opportunity to have what I hope is going to be a fact-based debate on possibly different views. With this, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Rachel West is from the Center for American Progress, and Stan Veuger is the American Enterprise Institute. And the way we're going to play it is that we're going to have one speaker start for about 7 minutes. I think 5 is a little bit too restrictive. Then the next one will speak for another 7 minutes, uninhibited and uninterrupted. And then they will be debating among them, possibly with some of my interruptions for 20 minutes. Now the question is, I want to randomize who's going to start. But I don't have a coin. So does anyone have
Rachel,
a coin?
do you want to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to go first if he's offering. I feel like I just got picked for the best.
Okay, so that's it.
Sure.
So Rachel, your go.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me here today. I'm absolutely thrilled. So I just want to start by laying out a little bit of putting the federal minimum wage in the U.S. in context, and then suggesting how minimum wage policy fits in with Americans' general notions of fairness, and then discuss some research on the benefits and costs of higher minimum wages. So most folks in this room will know that the federal minimum wage, which is currently $7.25, is pretty low by historical standards. It's about 35% below the inflation-adjusted peak, which was half a century ago. It's not indexed to inflation, so every year that Congress fails to raise it, it erodes further, and so it's lost about 12% of its value since it was last increased in 2009. It's also low by international standards. It's about 37% of our median wage compared to an OECD average of about 52%. So that means that a full-time year-round worker is making about $15,000 a year, which is 2 months of tuition at Yale, and also below the federal poverty level for a family of 2 or more people. For that reason, I think, and others, 29 states and DC have adopted higher minimum wages now, including New York and California, which are on their way gradually to $15, and that's about 20% of our workforce. Not many people in the United States actually make the federal minimum wage or below. It's about 3 to 4% of the workforce, but millions are affected by minimum wage policy because they're sort of in the band of a few dollars above $7.25. earnings effects, according to the research, go up to about the 30th percentile of the wage distribution when the minimum wage goes up. The current federal legislation, which is the Murray-Scott bill, would increase the minimum wage to $12 by 2020, so it's useful to sort of take a look at who that affects. It's about 25% of the workforce, so 35 million workers. And contrary to some myths, like these are not teenagers, 90% of them are in fact age 20 or older. The average age is 36. They're pretty well educated comparatively to previous decades. 45% have at least some college or an associate's degree. Nearly 30% are raising children, and minimum wage policy disproportionately affects women and workers of color in particular, who are more likely to be making low wages. Initially, when Roosevelt introduced the minimum wage in 1938, it was more about dignity and respect and fairness for workers than as an anti-poverty measure. But today, because the minimum wage is low and because we've seen sort of polarization in the labor market, it has increasingly become a really powerful anti-poverty tool. So the Murray-Scott bill that I mentioned before would raise about 6.6 million people out of poverty. So that's comparable to our largest anti-poverty program right now, which is the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's very popular with voters on both sides of the aisle. About 3/4 of American voters support raising the minimum wage, as do a majority of Republicans and about 60% of small business owners. And most tellingly, perhaps, low-income workers themselves are strong advocates of raising the minimum wage. Its popularity compared to other anti-poverty initiatives is sort of telling. Even Bernie Sanders, who is our token socialist, likes to say that no one who's working full-time should live in poverty. Notice he doesn't say no one should live in poverty, just no workers should live in poverty. So it's kind of puzzling that we haven't had more federal action and agitation to raise the minimum wage despite this popularity, and the fact that there are many working people in poverty who are playing by the rules, so to speak. And I think the reason that is because we've got a sort of narrow litmus test in Washington, D.C. in particular for what constitutes good minimum wage policy. It has to have zero job loss. And so economists have been arguing about this forever. There's a lot of research, and we have a wealth of data around minimum wage changes in the past, starting with this 1994 study that some people will be familiar with from David Card and Alan Kruger that found, perhaps surprisingly and contrary to what you might think from Econ 101, that workers received earnings increases, but that there was no discernible effect on employment. And those methods have since been generalized to look simultaneously at hundreds of different wage changes across the federal government, across time, across states, and so on, culminating with some recent research that I think is the sort of state of the art that compares bordering counties and many different wage changes across many different years and corroborates those initial findings that moderate minimum wage changes have not resulted in decreases in employment, despite the fact that they substantially boost workers' earnings. There's some disagreement among economists, as we will probably hear from my opponent over here, but a majority of economists— that'll be the good part. Yes, that's right. So it's nonetheless the case that when we're thinking about the benefits versus the costs of a moderate minimum wage increase, the University of Chicago took a poll of their expert economists back in 2013 about the benefits of a $9 minimum wage, and 62% of them said either agreed or strongly agreed that the benefits would outweigh the costs of making that change. So briefly, why might it be that that the Econ 101 model of supply and demand doesn't seem to apply well here? It looks like, when you look at the research, minimum wage changes are absorbed by employers in several different ways. So reduced turnover, increased productivity and efficiency in the workplace, lower profits, and also modest price increases for the consumer. There are a lot of other benefits to the workers.
1 minute.
Sorry?
One.
Got it. There's a lot of other research on benefits of minimum wages beyond earnings to workers that go to health, that go to tax revenues for the economy. My own research has looked at the intersection of the effect of minimum wage changes on spending on the social safety net. So programs like food stamps and Medicaid, since they are based on, their eligibility and benefit levels are based on workers' and families' incomes. When you raise those incomes, the benefit levels often go down. It still benefits the worker, but it also benefits the taxpayer, which is kind of interest for folks who are fiscal conservatives. All in all, I would say, just to close, that the evidence is there that there are substantial benefits to workers, and we should all be humble in this particular time when there are sort of unprecedented changes going on at the state level. We don't know all the answers yet, and there will be trade-offs, but it looks like, for the time being, at least moderate minimum wage increases have serious benefits to workers and our economy without big costs on jobs.
Thank you very much. So, Stan, it's your floor.
Thank you, Professor Meghir. I agree with some of what you just said. For example, I certainly agree with you that significant increases in the minimum wage are very popular among voters. It's perhaps one of the explanations for why the Democratic Party has done so incredibly well electorally over the last few years and now dominates the government both on the federal and the state level. So why do we want to have a floor on the wages that employers are allowed to pay their workers? Why do we want to ban certain transactions between employers and employees, right? Why do we want to say, okay, no, you're not allowed to work for that guy for $5 an hour? The historical origins of the minimum wage, I think, are slightly different from the way in which you represented them. I don't think they were fully about dignity. A big goal of minimum wages in the 1920s, 1930s, the progressive era, was to limit competition to white workers by non-white workers. I think that ugly historical past is purely a thing of the past, but I do think it is important to keep in mind that from the start, people realized that by increasing the minimum wage, you eliminate from the labor market many lower skilled and less experienced workers. And we still do that, in effect, I will argue. I don't think that's the goal of the minimum wage. What the goal is of the minimum wage and the entire safety net that we have now is to redistribute income from rich to poor without reducing the opportunities that lower income Americans have to enter the labor market themselves, earn income and construct a better life. Now, I would argue the minimum wage is not a particularly good way to do that. First of all, it doesn't redistribute income very effectively. The previous rendering of minimum wage increase pushes that the Democratic Party went through when the objective was a federal minimum wage of $10.10. That was 10-10. That sounded good. It's like you can make radio jingles out of it. They've gone to 12 and out of 15, but because you got to keep you got to keep the base excited. And I think most of the people who push for these things live in big cities, so they think 15 is a reasonable number as opposed to 8 or something along those lines.
Talk about that.
When that happened, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that about 15% of the wage gains would go to families living below the poverty line. That's an incredibly poorly targeted welfare program by any standard. So 85% of the increases in wage payments would go to households above the federal poverty line. 65% would go to households above twice the poverty line. Right? So a lot of this income does go to families with dual earners or with kids who work one of their earliest jobs. They don't have to be teenagers, but they can be in their early 20s. So I think on that front, the minimum wage is not a good policy, especially when you realize that a lot of the minimum wage workers themselves work in industries that cater to relatively low income households. Right? So not only do we redistribute very few of the wage gains to low income workers, we also raise prices on products that low-income households themselves purchase disproportionately. So what can we do instead, right? We can try to come up with programs that redistribute income more effectively without creating terrible work incentives. An example of such a program is the Earned Income Tax Credit, which you mentioned. A full-time worker earning the minimum wage, say a household of 2 with kids, ends up above the federal poverty line precisely because they receive the Earned Income Tax Credit, right? I mean, we can't do these calculations as if there's no safety net to argue for further increases in the safety net. The advantage of the Earned Income Tax Credit is that it also incentivizes work, right? It makes work more attractive because you receive a payment on top of your earned market income. And that is the, I think, second important thing that sets it apart from the minimum wage. Even though, you know, there are certainly papers in the economics literature that argue that there are small employment losses from minimum wage increases, some of them from the 90s, many from the last 15 years, mostly authored by Aaron Dubé and varying constellations of co-authors. I don't think that's not the only type of research that has been done. Right, so as you pointed out, most of those papers rely on comparisons between counties that are right next to each other. Counties that are right next to each other do not have to be similar to each other, right? They can just be on different sides of a state border. There is research that tries to match counties to counties that are similar. The results there are slightly different. But I want to point to 2 other strands of research in this field. One, perhaps the best-known paper, is by Jonathan Meghir of Texas A&M. What he finds is not that there are immediate job losses when the minimum wage is increased, but that the rate of growth of employment is hampered by minimum wage increases. A second one is perhaps best exemplified by a paper by Jeff Clemens of UCSD and one of his students. That paper looked specifically at the last time we increased the minimum wage. We increased the minimum wage during the Great Recession, right? So the minimum wage was $5.25 going into the financial crisis. Then during the crisis, at the height of the recession, we increased it by 40%, leaving it at $7.25 in 2009. According to Clemens and Veuger, that reduced labor force participation, especially among workers under the age of 30 without a high school degree, from where it started in 2006, about 38% of that most vulnerable group in the labor market worked, to about 23%. Now, some of that is because of the recession, but Clemens and Veuger argue, comparing states where the increase was binding to states where it was not, that about 1 million jobs in that category were lost because of the minimum wage increases. And that came at a horrible time, and it hurt exactly the wrong group of people.
That's fantastic.
Great.
So I would like to start the next bit by putting 2 questions.
Is it possible to just sort of address a couple of things he said?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to just immediately do a little rebuttal.
Yeah.
And vice versa, we can play it like that, and then I can put my questions.
Sure, I think so. Some of what you said I would agree with. Much of it I would not. But just to address a couple of things, those last 2 studies that you mentioned are sort of held up as these beacons of, you know, having found major evidence that that minimum wage changes have hurt the very folks that they are designed to help and so on. And I think both of them have serious methodological flaws. You actually touched upon the major one from the Clemens and Veuger paper, which is that they chose only changes in the minimum wage federally between 2007 and 2009, when we were in an unprecedented recession that hit hardest on certain states that just happened to be correlated with their propensity to adopt minimum wage policy. So I think that's a real problem for their study, and it's been replicated with other data. and the results don't seem to hold water outside of those couple of years, for example. So it brings it into question. And then the Mir and West study, it turns out that...
Well, not the West in question, just to clarify.
What? No, that's not me. His name's Jonathan or something. Jonathan? Yeah. Due respect, Jonathan. I haven't met him, but we share a wonderful last name. And I have some problems with his study, which I think is actually very, very well done. But it turns out that what's driving the changes in employment in that study is actually the manufacturing industry. And there is almost no low-wage labor in the manufacturing industry, and very little, if any, minimum wage labor in the manufacturing industry. And so when you look at when you segment, as a couple of researchers have done by industry and sector, what you actually see is that the changes are relatively random. With respect to the wage profile of the industry they're occurring in, and that low-wage sectors and industries are actually not showing job loss where you would expect, so restaurants and retail and so on. So that's a little puzzling, and it seems to be spurious.
Okay. I'd like to give 2 minutes to Stan, and then I want to open it up to the debate so we don't focus just on one aspect of the discussion. 2 minutes.
Now I really have to choose my line of defense. I want to step away for a moment from these two studies and think about why would you see an impact in different categories of labor from minimum wage increases, right? Because a lot of the argument relies upon aggregate employment numbers, but you don't have to expect that a minimum wage increase affects employment only at the bottom of the labor market. Right? There can be substitution away from labor to capital, which is implicit in measuring the aggregate impact of minimum wage increases. But I think it's important to keep in mind that you can also see an impact that goes from one type of labor to other types of labor. Right? If suddenly the lowest skilled workers become more expensive, you may want to hire some medium skilled workers. Those dynamics, I think, are important. And what is an object of fascination to me at times is that those dynamics, I think people on the left do accept when we debate issues of immigration, right? Where they say, well, if you get a ton of low-skilled workers coming into the country, they complement other workers, right? So the wages of the other workers do not have to go down. In a sense, the demand for labor is the demand for native labor is very inelastic. When we turn to the minimum wage and to price floors, the argument flips completely, and now suddenly the demand for labor is completely inelastic. And I don't think that's...
To be fair, I am not one of these people
making
this argument about immigration. I have different views on the research there, but yeah.
So both of you touched upon, I think, 2 really important issues, and I'd like you to perhaps debate that a little bit. Let's say that we live in a society where some kind of insurance is important, at least in my view. Of course, you can refute that, but I believe that insurance might be important. So that immediately sets the question, what's the best way of achieving this insurance? In other words, it goes back to the issue of targeting. Is the minimum wage a better way of targeting than, say, a combination of tax credits and out-of-work welfare? That's one question, but I'd like to couple it with another question, which is on the other side, which says, do we need a minimum wage to support tax credits in the sense that employers might be able to exploit their market power to absorb some of the benefit that's coming from the government if we don't force them to pay at least something? And actually, this is a serious point in the sense that the conservative British government decided, wrongly in my view, to eliminate tax credits and to replace them with minimum wages on the justification that employers are actually absorbing this. So fine, you go ahead, discuss, but I'd like these 2 organizing principles because I think they're useful beyond the minutiae of whether employment goes up or down. I think everybody agrees, whatever study you take, that employment effects at this level of the minimum wage are not huge either way. And that's my reading of the literature.
You want to go first?
Well, so you mentioned the earned income tax credit earlier, and I think that's sort of like on the table, and I would certainly like to respond to what you said there because it ties into your question. So to address first the broader question, should we have insurance? I agree with you, and I think most liberals and conservatives agree to some extent that the government should do something to prevent folks from being destitute. The question is, at what level and how. And so, in my mind, it does make sense to have a variety of responses, governmental responses that respond to the particular situations, whether it's job loss and earned insurance for job loss that we call unemployment insurance, or retirement, so lack of so there's sort of social insurance, and then there's social safety net programs, food stamps, and now welfare, which is a shadow of its former self, but TANF is the name of the program, and so on, for folks who really just need to fill basic needs to live in the short term. And then finally, sort of labor regulations, so that might be minimum wage, overtime, job scheduling that is fair to workers, and so on. So how much of all of that do we do? And then finally, there's tax credits, which have effectively replaced pretty much everything in the safety net, with the exception of food stamps in prominence for helping low-wage families. In my mind, there's a couple of problems with this. First of all, if the earned income tax credit in particular is very large for families with children, very slim for families without children who are also struggling, and it means that families with children are getting as much as like a third of their income at tax time, which we might agree is maybe problematic in that if you have an emergency in the middle of the year, you've effectively earned that income, but you can't get at it to help you prevent sort of downward spiral of poverty, right? Then the other problem I think with the EITC is one that you alluded to, which is that much of the benefit, so I think the estimate is about 36% of each additional dollar that we as taxpayers, it's the government that spends on the earned income tax credit, is actually captured by employers when there's not a strong minimum wage holding that up. So it's basically passed through. Most workers who receive the EITC are still benefiting, but workers who are not eligible for it or eligible for very little, they actually see their wages go down. So employers are capturing a lot of it. Ineligible workers, and especially workers without children, are being hurt, and workers with children are not being helped as much as they could. So I think that's the hesitation that I have with the way that we do social policy in this country when it's run mainly through the earned income tax credit, and there's no strong wage floor below it.
Thanks.
On the second point, I think we're actually in agreement to some extent, and I do think it's reasonable to think of the minimum wage as a sort of a lower bound on the bargaining power you give to workers in situations where employers have or appear to have something that looks like monopsony power. On the insurance front, I think I'm in less agreement with you, because I think that in certain ways the current system insures people too heavily. Right? So if you're a family with 2 children, your after-tax income is basically independent of your pre-market income up to maybe 3 times the poverty line. I think that provides terrible incentives. I think it's completely unfair to keep post-tax income that flat up to that high in the income distribution. On the other hand, as you pointed out, we also have way too little insurance for people who do not constitute full households. Right? As you said, there's very limited EITC payments for childless adults. We could change that also because it would make administering the EITC much less of a nightmare. Right? Because right now I think the typical estimates are about 30% of the payments are erroneous to some extent. Mm-hmm. And typically that's not because anyone is actively committing fraud, it's just because it's very hard to define whose kid someone is in many circumstances in the relevant part of the income distribution. So I agree with you there that You know, there are people who fall through the cracks in ways that shouldn't happen. At the same time, I think there are terrible work incentives for other households and other situations, certainly in states that have generous Medicaid programs.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I can just ask a question. So one thing, I'm not quite sure what you mean. If you could maybe give a couple examples of what you mean by up to 3 times the poverty line, like there's basically no correlation, I think I heard you saying, between a family's pre-tax income and their post-tax income, and I assume that you mean when you monetize the value of their health insurance.
Of the different welfare programs, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that suggests that we have a very generous welfare system, and I think that
a very poorly designed
one. If you're missing variable between the two is family structure, then I think
No, I'm comparing households with 2 kids in states that have a more generous welfare Medicaid program, say, than Arizona. Right? You earn a bunch of money, then you lose your Medicaid, which is a big drop if you take a dollar for dollar.
Well, if you expanded Medicaid, then what you would have is a nice smooth transition onto heavily subsidized healthcare insurance. Now, if one can debate in a different city right now whether how the ACA is doing on that, but that's the idea, right?
You don't think the Medicaid expansion money would be absorbed by employers? Because now, presumably...
No, I do.
Presumably
that
it works exactly the same way it works for the ITC.
I'm arguing
we expand Medicaid, that money is taken away from workers who do not qualify for Medicaid.
So what I was quibbling with is that there's a strong benefit cliff where workers would maybe have, the implication would be that they would want to stop working at some point at some number of hours that allows them to stay on Medicaid. The ACA was supposed to eliminate that last, and I think we can very much agree that we want a well-designed welfare system. I wouldn't call it social assistance, social insurance. We do. I'm interested also in what you said about setting a lower bound on the minimum wage representing, maybe for conservatives in general, sort of lower bound of the bargaining power that we're willing to give to workers. I was going to ask you whether you advocated abolishing the minimum wage entirely, or whether there is, or what you think of the fact that if Congress doesn't act to raise it, it will continue to erode year after year and be less in real value to folks who are sort of stuck at the bottom. Or if you, to eliminate some policy uncertainty, would say, hey, let's pick a value, let's index it, and let's give employers some certainty in their future labor costs.
I would let it erode probably at the federal level, because I think there are such large productivity and cost of living differences between different parts of the country that it strikes me as crazy to set that lower bound on bargaining power at the federal level. Now you may worry that states like maybe Alabama and Mississippi come to mind would not have a minimum wage. So you can leave it at maybe $5 an hour, so that they do not have that possibility. I would very much hesitate to.
That hurts.
I would very much hesitate to raise it to say $12, which I think is in private the current stance of the Democratic Party.
I think it's public. The Democratic Party is to 12 by 2020 is the sort of federal law.
It's not 15 anymore? It was 15 up to November 8th, and now it's 12 again. John Boehner used to say that the Democrats always want to increase the minimum wage in even years.
We can make a lot of political jokes here. If
political comments are not.
I don't think that you want to be on the Republican side of the political
comments are taking us away from. Political comments are taking us away from substance.
Yes,
so I'm going to intervene here, and I'm going to ask two questions.
But to wrap that up, I think that's right. That that we have concerns about geographic variation, and those are very real, and that affects how we.
$12 would be very high for a lot of states. It would cover. I think, even some big states. I think in Texas, about 60% of the hourly workers are below $12 an hour.
Well, so you have to
losses
think about that. The fact that it's going to be 1080 in real terms or so by the time it's phased in 2020. But I agree with you that there is a point at which we want to think seriously about lower wage states and low cost of living states.
So what I loved about the way you were discussing before is that you really brought out what I think is one of the most important issues here. that we cannot view the minimum wage in isolation without considering the entire, if you like, social insurance welfare system. It's part of that. So I want to ask two questions again. First of all, one is a factual question, which I do not exactly know the answer. What proportion of a worker's career is spent on minimum wages? That has to do, of course, again, with targeting. And secondly, who should be responsible for social insurance? The private sector or the taxpayer? And what is more transparent politically?
I think most workers are never on the minimum wage.
Sorry?
Most workers are never on the minimum wage. Some workers.
Is it the transient state or is it the permanent state?
No, I think that's factual. Like, what is perhaps more important is, who is making at or near minimum wage, who is a low wage worker, however we want to define.
I was trying to calculate what the distribution is of percent of shares of people's career they spend on the minimum wage.
Because that's key.
Yeah,
for sure.
it is.
Yeah.
And I think there are. This is difficult because a lot of the people who make the minimum wage have work lives with interruptions, right? So they enter at the minimum wage, they drop out again, they enter the minimum wage. That's I would doubt that there are many workers who spend more than 10 years making the minimum wage in states that have not drastically increased the minimum wage recently.
I think that point is well taken. That and in my reading of the evidence, as we have an increasingly sort of polarized labor market, low wage jobs have less of an upward trajectory. So the common rhetoric seems to be, at 18 you got this minimum wage job, and then you went to college and you got a better job, and so on. Minimum wage and low wage workers are no longer. That is no longer their profile. The average age, like I said, of folks who are making $12 or under is 36. And so I think the trajectory matters a lot. And so the question could maybe be like, what percent of time do people spend at low wages? And I think that increasingly there's less of an upward trajectory than we would like to think from these jobs. They're not high quality. We're not creating the kind of high quality jobs for the folks at the bottom. And I think minimum wage policy is part of that. One effect that I would expect that raising the minimum wage to have would, on the one hand, be to raise the sort of standards for creating quality jobs in the future, so that we would have a sort of slower evolution of the labor market toward higher quality jobs. Folks stay in those jobs longer. They invest more. The firm invests more in on-the-job training, for example, which we've seen massively decline. And that way we get a system where instead of very high turnover, very low quality jobs at the bottom that aren't worth keeping if your child gets sick or your transportation isn't there one day, because you can get an interchangeable job the next day, we'll have somewhat higher quality jobs at the bottom.
So I think the answer is we don't know for sure. But probably very few, but more if you increase the income under which we're accounting. And I think a reasonable chunk of the older minimum wage earners, a reasonable chunk of those are low-skilled immigrants. Another big chunk are people with big interruptions in their participation in the labor market, right? So those are not people who've been on the minimum wage since they were 18, right? They're people who had long spells of unemployment or of incarceration or of complicated family situations. So I think the number is really small. Of course, some of these workers are low-skilled immigrants, right? We can't help them until they enter the country. The other workers who had spells of unemployment in their 20s, for example, are precisely the workers that we should be most worried about. And right now we have a situation where people without a high school degree under the age of 30, about 23% is working. That's very few, right? So that other 77%, I mean, those people need work experience. If they enter their 30s without ever having held a job, that's, the rest of their working life is not going to be a particularly glorious one, right? So I'm more worried about the people we harm by raising the minimum wage, especially for what is still for a lot of people entry-level jobs, or should for a lot of people be entry-level jobs. I think, I'm more worried about the harm done there than about the little bits of redistribution we managed to do through the minimum wage increase.
So I'm very worried about these folks as well, and I think there's a national conversation starting about them that ties into criminal justice reform, that ties into disability and labor force participation. But I'm not as worried about them when it comes to the minimum wage. I think, in fact, there's an argument to be made and research to be done that some folks are on the sidelines because wages are so low and because job quality is so low. So the Council on Economic Advisors, I think, did some preliminary analysis on labor force participation relating it to. They, to my knowledge, don't have a website yet, but I could be wrong.
They've been appointed.
No, this one belongs to Obama and Jason Furman.
Yeah.
Basically, there's some evidence that labor force participation, which we're worried about because there's been a long-term decline, especially amongst the groups that you mention, is higher
but it's
in
not such
states
a long-term
where
decline, right? It was 50 10 years ago. This is not.
You're right. Phrased more carefully, there are folks whom we expect to be participating in the labor market who are not in specific cohorts to the same extent that we think they are. There's actually more of, as much as we hear about the missing men in the labor force, it actually looks as though from 2000 on, women's labor force participation has actually taken a deeper dive, but we attribute different reasons to that, perhaps wrongly. But I think criminal justice issues are definitely at play here. There's a lot to be said about the opioid addiction and current conversations around that and so on. But that doesn't explain all of it. And I think maybe raising wages might be, it's an interesting test whether that gets some folks back in the labor market.
So who should be responsible for running welfare? The government and through the legislature, or the firms?
Well, ideally, the firms would come up with very productive things to do for people.
I'm talking about welfare.
I know. Well, so there's I think you can sell on a mix, right? So right now we have a system where basically what firms do on the welfare front is they provide health insurance to relatively well-off workers. And then they do a little bit of pension contributions. They pay for some child care and some maternity leave, but also mostly in the top half of the income distribution.
And are heavily subsidized by the government for that in some cases.
Not as heavily as Secretary Clinton wanted, but heavily. I don't think that's certainly not a good way to organize a system, right? So I think you'd want to move away from those features of, I think, private sector involvement in redistribution and social insurance. Now, I imagine that's not exactly what you were asking. You were thinking more about what should we force firms to do for lower income workers?
Yeah.
And so there,
if anything.
Yeah. So I am not sure. So we have a minimum wage, and we have a bunch of mandates for employers. We've seen that with only those pieces in place, we have, labor force participation rates that aren't great. Certainly not in the lowest skilled cohorts, or the lowest skilled chunks of the labor market. Certainly not in recent cohorts. It strikes me as crazy to then say, no, we need to double down on that, make those workers less attractive to employers who are already not hiring them. Instead, I would say, if you want to do something, do it through the government. Some of it you can do through state government. Some of it you can do through the federal government. I think increasing the EITC, especially for childless adults, is not a bad idea. You could do a payroll tax cut if you want to do a tax cut. I think those two options should be on the table. I think it's crazy to say, look, labor force participation among among low-skilled workers is in the 20s. Let's make it more expensive to hire them. I don't think that's.
So Rachel, your response to that, and then perhaps I'll give you half a minute to close each.
Sure. So I largely agree that that the way that we have in the past operated, I think welfare is one term for it, but not the term that we would use in this country. Worker benefits, right, have been tied to work. And that's just an artifact of our history. I think it is healthy to move away from that, as you suggest, both because it gives employees more freedom. It makes employers responsible for one thing front and center, which is the wages that they pay to employees. And it decreases, so for example, health insurance, having a safety net there in some respect for low-income adults through Medicaid decreases things like job lock, which we hope will sort of reverse the decline in entrepreneurship that we've seen. People are free to try out their ideas, and young people are not going to be completely destitute if they try an idea and it fails.
We can't have both monopsony and job lock.
So in any case, I think I agree with the basic point that, like, let's do less, especially sort of for high income workers. Let's stop subsidizing so much the benefits that are provided, and just provide some of those by an entity that experiences economies of scale and is supposed to have everybody's interest in mind, which is the government. But I do think it's important to keep in mind that on the low end right now, employers are actually getting the reverse. They're not providing benefits. They're taking taking advantage of the benefits that government offers to lower income folks. So that's SNAP, and that's Medicaid, and that's the EITC, because they're able to pay lower wages and get labor supply still at that wage. So they're benefiting from it, whereas if there were competitors on the higher end offering benefits to workers, that would be an unfair advantage to very low wage employees.
Okay, on that note, so Stan, just about 30 seconds, 40 seconds closing, and then Rachel.
So yeah, I think we can both agree that for now we should leave the federal minimum wage alone, increase the increase the EITC for.
I like how you did that.
Increase the EITC for childless adults, and now that we're at full employment, hope that President Trump does not start a nuclear war, and see if we can have some upward pressure on wages throughout the.
So we can definitely agree on nuclear war. That one I'm totally going to give you. I think the federal minimum wage needs to be substantially higher than it is now. All policies have trade-offs, but I think that it's clear that the place where we are now, trade-offs are few enough that it's clear we need to go in one direction. And I think the EITC is an incredibly important program. It's right now our most powerful anti-poverty program, but it should work in complement with and in tandem with a strong minimum wage, not as a substitute to it. But nuclear war, we're definitely there. Yeah.
Minimum wage for nuclear war workers, no. Okay, so thank you very much, both of you. It's fantastic. So we'll open it up for debate now. The way the rules are, you can express your opinions, but you can't start on a long talk and try and finish with a question. Okay,
questions end with a question mark.
Back there on the bottom right.
Hello, thank you for coming today. I was wondering if both of you could speak to your beliefs about the future of the minimum wage system and its workers, given expectations regarding the future of the American economy with respect to the capital skill complementarity hypothesis.
How do you want to?
Do you want me to repeat the question?
I was in college for nearly a decade.
I think what we're seeing, if there is an increase in the the complementarity of human capital and other types of capital, right? If we see a persistence in the increase of the college premium and things like that, is that what you're asking about? How does that interact with the minimum wage if we have more of a hollowing out of the labor market?
I'm referring to the complementarity of high-skilled labor to technology.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, precisely. Right. So you.
The automation question,
Yeah.
essentially.
Well, obviously, if all of the high-skilled workers are becoming more productive and low-skilled workers are becoming less productive, then any minimum wage will become more binding, and the disemployment effects of raising it will become larger. Now, to be particularly worried about that, you have to believe that we know that the complementarity of high skill human capital and technology will continue to increase. I don't know if that's true. I don't think we're particularly good at forecasting large labor market trends. A lot of people in Silicon Valley, I think, seem to believe that half of the currently existing jobs will be destroyed in the next 2 years. Ironically, they have not yet developed a secure messaging app, despite 20 years of trying really hard. So I don't know.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. The jury is still out, but we have been through periods of high automation before, and here we are once again at 4.7% unemployment. The robots have not yet taken all the jobs, and I think Silicon Valley has a little bit of robot bias, thinking that they will. So I think there's not strong evidence yet that that skills-based technological bias and so on is going to operate such that the low end of the labor market in the near term should be that we should be super worried about all of the low-skilled workers losing their jobs. That said, one thing, like I said, that the minimum wage does when you increase it is to encourage the economy to evolve toward more investment in workers on the job, and so that is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy then for lower wage workers who are gaining skills on the job because of improved productivity, lower turnover, and so on. So I'm not sure there's cause to be concerned.
Well, you seem to say that Silicon Valley seems to believe this, and that it's not going to happen tomorrow. I guess what would be your rebuttal to when you look at California and you see McDonald's? I don't know when the last time you walked into McDonald's was, but the last time I did, there was, instead of talking to a person, I decided what I wanted to order, and then I swiped my card, and then only one person brought me my food. Instead of interacting with 3 people, I interacted with 1 person. And California wants $15 minimum wage. Don't you think that's directly pricing out people like that? And also, just on a automation repetition point, backing up on what Karina said, truck driving is the biggest profession in like 29 out of the 50 states in the United States. Truck driving in Colorado, Coors just did an automated truck ride, like 100 miles. There was a guy in the car, but that in the truck, that's clearly
He's
somewhere.
so yeah.
That's clearly an example where that's if you price out, if you raise the minimum wage and you're pricing out all these lower end jobs. Do you have a universal basic income? Where do you go next?
So I don't think we're there yet that we need to be considering a UBI, although it's always good to think big. I think that these examples are a little stylized and myopic, and they come up again and again in the news media because they're sexy. Like robots are sexy, self-driving cars are sexy. All of that may be coming, but what is lacking is evidence thus far that is displacing jobs in a serious manner. It's still the case that actually automation has been, by the data, has been progressing less quickly in the past decade than in previous years, and that's evident in productivity numbers. So productivity growth has been much slower since 2005 than in the couple decades before that. So my basic answer to that is I'll believe it when I see it writ large in the data. California is an interesting example. I said earlier, I think we should be humble. We don't know what entirely is going to happen. But I like the fact, and I think it's good for the economy in general, if higher minimum wages do spur some technological innovation and productivity increases. We'll wait to see how the labor market adapts.
Where in California was this? Yeah, so very few fast food restaurants have these technologies for now because they don't work that well. Voters in San Francisco have decided they don't want to live close to poor people. So you're going to have a few of those places where there are no fast food workers who can commute in time.
They also like gadgets a lot.
They also like gadgets a lot.
Gadgets.
They like retail stores that sell chairs that have speakers in them.
We should I went to Berkeley. We should just make fun of hippies.
Yeah, well, you know, I agree on this with Rachel that, you know, I don't think we're there yet. The trucks business is, you know, I mean, yes, that's a large category of employment, but presumably, you know, we'll transition into a new world slowly. Airline pilots have basically been, you know, watching a computer fly a plane for 50 years now, and you know that hasn't changed much. Their pay has, you know, has declined, but not as rapidly as you would think. So I mean, given productivity growth over the last 25 years, I think the last thing we need to worry about is that technological progress is going too fast, to be honest, in the sort of broad-based manufacturing and service parts of the economy.
From a growth standpoint, it's a problem we'd love to have.
Yeah, so presumably you, Dr. Veuger, don't want to say that, you know, one job being lost is not worth huge gains to lots and lots of workers. That seems very implausible. But presumably you, Ms. West, don't want to say that, you know, all these gains, you know, would be worth any amount of unemployment. So it seems like for both of you to really have given a sort of satisfactory, coherent argument for a normative position about the minimum wage, both of you have to have some premise about how much job loss, all else equal, is worth how much gain to workers who remain employed, all else equal. So I guess this might be kind of an abstract question. What's the ratio? What should sort of the philosophical trade-off schedule be? Because I don't see how we can coherently answer this question without basically having a philosophical debate about that.
I think from where we currently stand, we don't face that trade-off because I think we can lower the federal minimum wage and maybe raise the minimum wage in certain high productivity places, expand other federal anti-poverty programs, and get better outcomes without any disemployment effects produced by increasing the minimum wage.
Yeah, I think you caught us. It's a great question. Like, what are our criteria? What is our break-even point for acceptability and tolerance? And I don't have a great answer to that for my part, because in part I think we're not great at measuring it. And we will always disagree when we do try to measure it, right? But also, it's not just benefits to workers; it's benefits to the economies, to communities. There are downstream effects on health, and in particular, like children's long-run outcomes. When they're growing up in poverty, it's really, really bad for our future workforce, and so on. So I don't have to me, the ratio of job loss to, you know, some metric of gain, it's a salient one, but I'm not sure, first of all, what that full metric of gain should be in the denominator. And second of all, I'm not sure even if I picked one that I would know what kind of trade-off I can tolerate. And in the end, it's not my decision. It should be the decision in part of lower wage workers, you know, working with coalitions of business owners.
That sounds like she doesn't want a federal minimum wage, but she wants firms and employees to.
Should be higher. All I have to say. No, I would accept. I think the criterion that and to fault my side here, the left has too often used is, well, the minimum wage does not kill jobs. Period. End of story. I actually think that we will know when we've reached the bounds of good policy, when we know actually, with some credibility, how high can you push before there are employment consequences? And until we've gotten there, hey, maybe we're doing good things, reducing turnover, increasing wages, and increasing productivity, and maybe we should continue to squeeze that
Do
a
you
little
believe
bit.
that? Do you
Yeah,
think that,
I do. I
do you
think the
there's-
research evidence
How
shows.
many people do you think there are people on the left who believe that it was a mistake to raise the minimum wage by 40% in 2009?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think
do?
that we may come out swinging with united fists, but there's a lot of internal discussion, and there are a lot of folks who are outspoken in a nuanced way on the left. So folks at AEI and Brookings put together this poverty task force that recommended raising the federal minimum wage, but not by much. But those were presumably centrist.
Not me, just to be clear.
Okay, does not want to be part of that party. That's okay. There are people that I really
No, that's right.
there, and they came to a consensus. But no, I do think that we do need more evidence, and I'm personally undecided on some of these higher and especially quicker minimum wage increases. I think the phase-in period is equally important to the target wage.
Hi, thanks. My question is, to what extent could a change in immigration policy under the Trump administration serve as a de facto increase in the minimum wage because of less competition in the low-wage labor market?
So I don't know if it would be, if I can reframe that to say the real problem that I foresee and that is currently happening is that our government is driving folks underground, and if to the extent that they or their employers are not comfortable acknowledging that they are here and they're going to stay and they're going to work, but they're now doing so under the table or in a less formal fashion. If we're not enforcing our labor laws, that's going to drag down wages for native-born workers as well. So that's really, really short-sighted in my view. So maybe the minimum wage does provide a floor for documented workers, so to speak, or citizens. But in practice, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on wages in high immigration states, pulling them down if we stop enforcing our labor laws and continue to drive people underground with scary and short-sighted policies.
I think most people will get paid something close to their value added. I don't think that driving out millions of immigrants is going to increase the productivity of the people who remain. There may be some more effective rent seeking in certain situations, but I don't think the influx of large numbers of low-skilled workers had a sizable negative impact on low-skilled native wages. I don't think the opposite will have a big effect either. Yeah, I'm more worried about, so I don't think that's going to be helpful. I think, if anything, driving out sort of the high-skilled immigrants and the productivity and innovation that come with them will probably make life harder for everyone involved. So I don't think, either end of the potential implications of the current administration's immigration policies is going to be helpful for low-skilled workers.
Sorry. Can you talk a little bit about the effect of the decline in unionization on real wages, and if you see the age of unions, especially among low-paid workers, ever coming back?
Yeah. So we probably have different views on this. I think the decline in unionization has been just enormously impactful for folks on the middle and lower rungs of the income ladder, and that minimum wage policy is never going to. It is certainly not a silver bullet even for very low income workers, but it cannot match the strength of bargaining power that has been lost and its impact on wages. I think that's enormously important. There are, I think, with respect to low-wage service workers in particular, sort of newer models of sort of pseudo-unionization and bargaining emerging. But I don't think we're there yet, and I think we're going to see unionization in its formal sense continue to decline, unfortunately, which to my mind is really scary and is part of this story of polarization in the labor market.
I agree to some extent. I think that if you have the market power that comes with being able to shut down factories or industries, then obviously you can extract benefits from that. Certainly, if you also manage to cut off international competition, as I think was the case for many of the industries that people typically associate with the heyday of unionization. I don't think that losing that ability is necessarily a bad thing. It does have implications for the income for the income distribution that you may or may not like, but of course it also has implications on the consumer side in prices and quality of products you can purchase.
I would just say to that unions do have enormous positive externalities, so we don't need 100% of the workforce to be unionized, but we see many European countries a degree of unionization that has spillover effects to non-unionized workers as well, and we are just far below that. So.
Perhaps in this I would like to make an observation that unionization seems to have very different effects in very different contexts. So in some contexts, unions are kind of very cooperative and internalize the problems of the industry and the labor market. See Sweden, Germany, and others they are confrontational. See UK in the 70s. So do we understand that when we talk about whether unionization is good or bad? Do we understand what generates cooperation relative to confrontation?
Sadly, I'm no expert on unions, so I'll give this one to you.
I think the people who have the strongest views on this are the varieties of capitalism political scientists who believe that all of the features of your system have to be aligned and then they complement each other, and that's how Germany does well at the same time that the United States does well. And so they would say, no, you cannot just flip one on or off, right? So the United States would not necessarily benefit from more unionization because it doesn't have the corporate governance structures you need to make them work well. It doesn't have the educational system you need to make them work well, with heavy reliance on vocational training that is set up in coordination with firms, with unions, and that's not a very empirically focused literature, but they would argue that you cannot just switch one of the flips. You need to do them all, and that seems impossible.
So different social equilibrium.
That's right. Yeah.
You've solved all your problems? Yes, please.
So I think a lot of union contracts are tied to the minimum wage, correct? So if you were to increase,
I imagine CAP is unionized.
So if you were to increase the minimum wage substantially, isn't that going to increase the wages of unionized industries that often are not quite as competitive as non-union? And wouldn't that result in more job destruction that you're not capturing in this discussion?
So at the levels, I think the short answer is that at the levels that we're talking about, $7.25 minimum wage, unionized workers, there are very few unionized workers, even down anywhere near that, who would receive indirect spillover.
I mean the upward ripple effect.
But, so it does have a ripple effect up. I think one not so savory aspect of negotiations that have gone on with state and local minimum wages is that unions have often advocated for them and then have exempted themselves from them. And I'll throw you that one. That goes.
LA is a good
way
example.
back.
It goes back to the oranges of the minimum wage, as I.
And their justification, if I understand it, is that they provide additional benefits to workers that aren't captured in that wage. I think that's silly. For the most part, it's non-binding because the wages are that much higher. Nonetheless, it's I think a bad. It's sort of bad faith.
So one last question.
Yeah, so I've noticed in the past couple months after the election of President Trump, the Democratic Party's been more willing to endorse the principles of federalism and states' rights and minimum
Can you
wage.
give a couple examples?
Well, just like people saying the best way to resist is, the 11 states where the Democrats control the state houses and the legislature, California, Oregon, New York, Connecticut, so-and-so, and they can make policies through there. And minimum wage policy often happens on the state level as well. So do you think that in general, expanding outwards to the social safety net, is the social safety net going to be attacked, in these 11 states that are blue controlled? Are they going to try and focus on increasing the social safety net? And, how much are states' rights going to play a part in the minimum wage debate going forward?
That's a great question, and it's nice. It's fun to hear somebody say, states are the hub of minimum wage activity, because that's really only been true in the last few years. There's been this flurry of activity. As far as what the Democratic Party is concentrating on, a lot of it is probably desperation and lack of other options. But to be perfectly frank, yes, because that is where that's what we have left. DC is no longer there's very little progressive power there now, but the states are the laboratories of democracy, and we've got a few remaining great ones where we can try out, sorry, not to dish the other states under the bus, but as you said, there are approximately 11 where Democrats are able to pioneer some of these policies. So whether it's much higher minimum wages or other, social insurance and social assistance, or even, climate policies and so on. Yeah, I think you'll see a lot of that, so that it sets the ground for a decade down the line when our fortunes are reversed. Hopefully it's 4 years or fewer, but yeah, no, I would absolutely expect that kind of thing. So state level EITCs, beefing up unemployment insurance systems is one that I'm hoping for, paid family leave, and so on. Things that should be done at the federal level in Democrats' opinions that are not being done.
We'll probably see a bunch of Medicaid expansions on the state level too, actually, now that Republicans have agreed that Obamacare is the law of the land.
But those are not those blue states.
Oh, Kansas, North Carolina, Georgia.
Yeah. Hallelujah. It's free money. They're leaving money on the table.
Well,
if they don't do that.
Yeah, they thought it was
And people's lives, but
I know.
On this note of consensus, I think we should close the debate. So I'd like to thank both speakers for a really, really well documented and active debate.